right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to start taking a look at our unit on cell communication. So, chapter 11 is where we're going to start picking up this topic. And just so you kind of understand how this unit's going to get structured, chapter 11 really is kind of this big, broad overview of how cells use their molecular mechanisms in order to communicate and elicit responses from other cells in multicellular organisms. We're going to take what these big broad ideas that are presented in chapter 11 and then really take a look at how our bodies utilize those communication systems when we get to the rest of this unit and look more specifically and dig into the endocrine system and how hormones are utilized in organisms for communication purposes, and then also your nervous system and how we send those electrical impulses, as well as utilizing things like neurotransmitters for cells to communicate. So, what are we really talking about here? So, when we look at your cells and we look at cells specifically in multicellular organisms, there has to be this overarching ability for one cell to communicate its needs, its responses to other cells in that body. It's this big coordinated effort that actually allows you to function. If one piece of that system ends up falling apart, then clearly other cells aren't knowing what's going on, and your entire body is what kind of starts collapsing because that communication system breaks down. So when we talk about cell communication, it's kind of interesting to look at from an evolutionary standpoint because there are a lot of mechanisms out there that are very much finely tuned, controlled for that particular species, and yet overarchingly, every organism that we know uses cellular communication in one form or another, even when we're talking about individual microorganisms in, say, a bacterial colony, they all consist of some very similar, very universal mechanisms for how cells regulate what they need done. The other cool thing about this is that these communication systems are in fact systems. So you've got these combined effects from multiple signals that ultimately determine very specific cellular responses. So it's a way that we've kind of evolved uh, mechanisms to ensure we get done what we need, and then also have a lot of fine-tuned control over how much we get done, to what level to upregulate, downregulate. So kind of think of some of those terms we talked about when we talked about gene expression, because some of those concepts are actually going to come back. When we look at how cells communicate, one of the things they're often communicating for is to turn on transcription and translation, turn it off, or turn it up or turn it down, for certain proteins that those cells need in order to do the job that they're meant to function as. So when we look at the evolution of cellular signaling, like I said, there really are these sort of universal pieces. And one of those big pieces is this idea of a signal transduction pathway. And really, all this is going to be is these series of steps that occur within a cell. So once that cell receives its molecular signal from its external environment or from another cell in a multicellular organism, that signal gets received on the cell surface and then gets converted into a very specific cellular response. And we see these sorts of signal transduction pathways even in microbes. So take a look when you get to your textbook, with this figure right here. And what we're looking at are eukaryotic yeast cells. So they're eukaryotic, which means they've got a nucleus. That means they're going through that transcription translation pathway that we talked about. But what's going on here is that they are single celled organisms. So everything that they need done as an organism is happening in a single cell as opposed to us being multicellular organisms. So the cool thing here is that we see these very similar signal transduction pathways in these individual microbial cells that we also see in coordination in big multicellular organisms like us. So, what this tells us is that there's some very early origins of this signal transduction pathway and this mechanism for cellular communication. So, it's a really highly conserved process. It's been tailored through evolution for specific organisms and the environments they live in, but the overall pathway and the overall production and need for cellular communication clearly is pretty vital to the way organisms live and function, which is why we would see such an early origin of that process, and the fact that that process seems to be pretty consistent from one species to the next across a wide variety of phylogeny. So if you take a look and dig into this particular example with these yeast cells, they're utilizing their cellular communication really as a way to identify their mates. So they'll do a really interesting mating process in order to mix up their genetic information before they then go ahead and make offspring. So although they are technically asexually reproducing, remember some of the things we talked about with the downfalls to that and the lack of diversity in the population if that's all that they do, because they would be clones of each other. Bacteria have used things like conjugation as ways to get around that, and yeast cells have done the same. So, what they end up doing here is we've got these two mating types, so your A and your alpha, and they will produce these mating factors. What they really are, they're pheromones. They're chemicals that these cells are secreting to sort of attract their mate. So, the A cell will produce its A factor or A pheromone that is specifically shaped to attach to receptors that are on the alpha cells. The alpha cells are then doing the same. And so, what that will do then is that they will attach to those opposite receptors, cause signal transduction pathways to happen within these two cells that will then ultimately cause a response for those cells to induce this fusion of these yeast cells, and then they'll go off and reproduce from there. So spend a little time taking a look at that as you work through the reading guide. It's kind of an interesting scenario to understand how cells are doing cellular communication outside of the multicellular realm, which is what we're going to focus mostly on. So when we look at multicellular organisms, we've got to be able to have the capacity to do signaling that is both local, meaning within cells in the same tissue, as well as long distance signaling, where we're taking information from, say, your brain all the way out to your muscle cells, or from your brain to your thyroid gland or your ovaries. So your cells have to be able to communicate, and they do this via these chemical messengers. So plants and animal cells actually have these cell junctions that directly connect their cytoplasms from one adjacent cell to the next in a tissue. So if you go back to remembering what we talked about with cell structure, all right, if we look at animal cells, they've got channels that will connect one cell to the next in a tissue. Those are your gap junctions. Plasmodesmata exist between plant cells in a plant tissue. This just helps to speed up that local signaling by their ability to create molecules that don't have to go outside of their cell membrane in order to make it to the next cell. So it kind of expedites that ability for tissues to coordinate the functions that they are performing in that point in time. So what we're talking about really with those things like the gap junctions and the plasmodesmata are things like local signaling, where your animal cells are capable of communicating in direct contact with each other. And so they use things that are what we would consider local regulators. These are just messenger molecules that really can only travel local distances. So they can be something like what we're seeing back here, where they just go straight through these junctions, or they can be released out into the extracellular matrix, into interstitial fluid, tissue fluid, and then be diffused to cells nearby. That being said, remember that diffusion only works really well over short distances, so any sort of diffusion of local regulators is going to happen from one cell to a very closely neighboring cell in order to elicit a response there. And then you can also have local signaling across things like your synaptic cleft here. So here's your end of your one neuron to the target cell on another. This could be another neuron. This could also be something like a muscle cell. And you get those neurotransmitters that diffuse across that synapse and allow receptors to then be signaled here and have a response occur in that target cell. So when we look at local signaling, it gets broken down into two types. Your paracrine signaling is what we're going to look at here first. So I've got this secretory cell, the cell whose job it is to go through that transcription and translation pathway and produce all of these local regulators that eventually will go from your rough ER through a vesicle to your Golgi to another vesicle, and then eventually gets secreted out of this cell through the cell membrane. Those local regulators then will be released into that extracellular fluid and get taken up by these target neighboring cells out here. So a great example of a signal like this would be things like growth factors. So something has maybe caused damage to this cell, it's needing to go through apoptosis, and so it's going to send out these growth factors to these neighboring cells saying, hey, I'm going to die, I'm going to have to get cleaned up, I'm going to have to get removed, and you guys are going to need to go through mitosis to now fill in the gap that I'm creating. Synaptic signaling is also still local, but here again, we're making those neurotransmitters. They're being diffused across our synapse here to a target cell adjacent to that, which will cause a response in this target cell here. You can also then have your long distance signaling, which is where your endocrine system really comes in the production of those hormones or hormone signaling. So you've got all sorts of specialized cells, endocrine glands throughout your body, whose job it is, once again, to go through their own version of transcription and translation to produce those hormones. Those hormones then will get released into body fluids. If we're talking about humans, then we're talking about, more often than not, those hormones being released directly into your bloodstream, and then they can then travel throughout your body to then attach to target cells somewhere else. So you can talk about something like your brain producing something like oxytocin, and that then travels to a woman's uterus, causes contractions during childbirth. So not something that is necessarily working on a target cell right next to the secretory cell. Instead, it's traveling a much greater distance throughout your body in order to create the response that is necessary.